So my presentation is on the fragmentation of archaeology, looking at some of the hurdles of a divided discipline. And I will be splitting it into 4 sections. First, looking at how we are lacking a definition to archaeology on an international scale. And then looking at the need for a definition through what I call the archaeological domain. And then how that lack of definition impacts the institutional landscape of archaeology, particularly looking at the landscape in UK. And then finally looking at why this is important in terms of funding and time. So from the start, archaeology has always struggled with its multifaceted nature, with the most explicit discussions of archaeology starting around the mid-1800s, looking at the duality of archaeology as it related to history and art. And then this continued throughout the 1900s up until the 1960s, when William Phillips tied archaeology directly to anthropology. And then after this point, there was an explosion of attempts to define archaeology as it related to specific archaeologists, looking at whether it's related to anthropology, plastics, history, or other disciplines. This has created a real problem in archaeology because there are a lot of these dualities or divisions within the discipline between science and social science, academic and professional archaeology, processualism, post-processualism, and between archaeology and anthropology. And it really creates a question of what is archaeology? Are we here to survey, analyze, preserve, conserve, or interpret? And this is a major issue in what archaeologists do, and it can lead to a lot of archaeologists being overburdened with work or often being taken advantage of because there's really no definition to what it is that we do. And we often take on different roles, from surveyors and excavators to historians and archivists to IT managers and database managers. And we all also have our own material specializations, regional and period specializations, and often a lab or a technical specialization to add into the jack of all trades that we've become. So this introduces the issue of the domain, the need for better definition in archaeology. The domain is a philosophical concept that is the body of information, the questions and answers that lead to that body of information, and the disciplinary structure that allows us to ask those questions and get some answers from them. Every discipline has its own domain. The more well-ordered sciences, like the natural sciences and physics and chemistry, have a stronger domain, whereas the more social science and younger disciplines have less ordered domains, which is where archaeology kind of sits. And there are different components that each domain has, depending on the discipline and the issues that they face. So I argue that the archaeological domain has 8 specific components, and they might seem a little bit kind of common sense issues, but it really depends on the archaeologist that you're asking, where they're from, what type of thing they study, and who's taught them. So, excuse me, the first issue is the subject and content of research. What do archaeologists actually study? This is an issue that gets wrapped up in debate a lot with materiality, and material culture. And it's something that seems like we've already established it, but it really never has been established, whether we're studying the artifacts or the people behind the artifacts, which is part of the second issue of purpose. What do archaeologists actually do? And that's a question about whether it is we're studying the people behind the artifacts themselves, whether we're conserving, interpreting, or doing something else. And those 2 components lead into the topic of the discipline. Where does archaeology start and end? And how do we define what it is that archaeologists need to be an archaeologist? The types of educations, degrees, certifications that we need to be able to do what we need to do. And this has created a lot of fragmentation in the discipline as methodology and education differs depending on where you are. So there is no uniquely archaeological scientific method. And that's created a really big divide between scientific archaeology and the more humanistic archaeologies, which is evident in the 5th component of theory, where the theory of archaeology has been dominated by interpretive and narrative-driven theories, while practical theories and meta-theories about theory have often been kind of left to the side. And that's created a big divide between academic and commercial archaeologies around the world, where a lot of theory is left to one side of that divide, and the other side focuses primarily on practice, even though the issues are beneficial to each other. And part of this issue, again, the science divide between science and humanistic archaeology, is the issue of scientific attitude and engagement, which is really simply the desire to pursue science and scientific goals, but also to engage in those practices whenever possible. And part of that is the seventh component as well, which is systematicity, to approach it, all aspects of the discipline systematically. And this is something, again, that differs depending on what type of archaeologist you are, where you're from, and who you've been educated with, which creates a lot of problems in terms of data accessibility, data quality, and data comparability. And all of this is necessary for defining archaeology, but the most important component is the component of conventionality, which is a formal and international collaborative organization that can provide a stable but dynamic platform for these definitions and these discussions. And archaeology has really struggled with the institutional landscape. And the next section will look at the cycles of fragmentation of archaeology and the UK's fragmented landscape, particularly looking at the size of the discipline, which I think is very important. So recently, archaeologist Christian Christensen from Sweden argued that archaeology follows a cycle of ideology and theory, pushing from science into more romantic ideas and then pulling back and forth, which can be seen in processualism and post-processualism. Christensen argues that there is a period of consolidation where new scientific techniques like carbon dating or pollen analysis are integrated into the core of archaeology after periods of critique from the more romantic side of archaeology, more narrative-driven side of archaeology. However, I argue that a more realistic representation is what's seen in the lower figure, where at the peaks of each cycle, the archaeological theory and archaeological thoughts move off into separate extreme branches, never really feeding back into the cycle and working with the critiques and debates of the larger cycle. And this is what I argue has created a distinct fragmentation in archaeology, where all of these distinct branches continue on endlessly and create new and multiple waves or cycles of archaeology that run parallel but rarely interact. As you can see in this figure, this is a overly simplified model, but there are many different cycles in archaeology, as I mentioned before, those between academic and commercial archaeology, those between the science and humanistic archaeologies, and between theory and practice. These cycles rarely interact, as we can see in this situation around the world with commercial archaeology and academic archaeology, where theory and a lot of philosophy is held in one section, whereas most of the practical and methodological advancements are held in another section of archaeology. And you can see this a lot in the institutional landscape of the UK. And this kind of complicated image here only shows a portion of the UK's organizations that are meant to represent archaeology. In total, there are around 71 different organizations that represent archaeology or its related fields. And I've split it into three sections: commercial, academic, and international, but these spheres themselves are further fragmented. So in the commercial side, we have groups like CIfA, Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, which is the professional body. And they're one of the larger professional bodies in the world. And they provide standards and ethics for certain parts of the discipline. But there are also groups like the Society of Antiquaries, the British Archaeological Association, FAME, the Council for British Archaeology, and the Association of Local Governments each seek to represent different parts of the discipline. And all of these organizations produce their own gray literature, their own industry reports, their own manifestos, and their own publications that suit their small user groups. We also have the academic side of archaeology, which in the UK has about 60 different university departments, countless journals, and a number of conferences as well. And a lot of these kind of bridge the national and international spheres. And these areas often hold a lot of the research, a lot of the technological advancements, but also hold a firm grasp on a lot of the publications and conferences around the world. And you can see the fragmentation of archaeology in a lot of the journals of archaeology. So for example, in the Journal of Archaeological Science, their scope is focused primarily on new scientific techniques and scientific discussions. And they tend to ignore a lot of the theoretical and philosophical issues of archaeology. Whereas groups like, or journals like the Archaeological Dialogues or the Norwegian Archaeological Review focus very heavily on the theoretical aspects, but tend to ignore a lot of the scientific and practical aspects of archaeology. And then to add into this entire complex system is the international sphere. And there are even more organizations and conferences like the European Association of Archaeologists, the World Archaeological Congress, or the International Union for Proto and Prehistoric Sciences. And they have, again, their own research, their own journals, and their own focus and user groups. And to make things even more complicated are the data silos that exist throughout the world. So in the UK, we have the Archaeological Data Service. In the US, we have the Digital Archaeological Record, TDAR, as well as Open Context. And there are additionally 20 other data silos that exist throughout the world, representing different parts of archaeology. Now, this is a bit concerning because of the size of UK organizations. The Chartered Institute for Archaeologists is one of the largest professional bodies representing archaeology, with the other large organization being the Register for Professional Archaeologists in the US, which only has about 4,000 members. The UK's institutional organizations vary greatly, and these are only the 19 organizations that argue that they directly represent archaeologists in some way. The largest of them being the Council for British Archaeology with about 4,000 members, and also the Society of Antiquaries of London, which has about 3,300. The Council for British Archaeology and the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists work very closely together and have a lot of overlap in the membership. And one of the major issues with this and the number of members is that the total number of members is only about half of the population of archaeologists in the UK. The total population of archaeologists in the UK is around 6,300, with about 87% of that being in commercial or professional archaeology, and only about 13% of that being in academic archaeology. So it's a little troublesome that only 49% of the discipline is represented by our organizations. Even more troubling is the overall size of archaeology. The numbers might be a little bit skewed because of the lack of definition to archaeologists. The studies that have been done on the size of the discipline generally rely on identifying archaeologists as people who have a minimum of a bachelor's degree and work in specific organizations. So the surveys have found that there's somewhere between 50,000 and 60,000 archaeologists worldwide. Just for reference, the entire discipline could fit into Wembley Stadium with about 30,000 extra seats available. And for more reference, other UK organizations that have professional bodies like UK Law, UK Civil Engineering, and UK Medicine can accommodate hundreds of thousands of individuals in a single organization, and often are the only organization that those individuals can apply to be qualified as practitioners of that discipline. Oops. And so why is all of this important? I'll address in two parts, theory, method, and data, and standards, laws, and rights. So the first part, theory, practice, and data, like I mentioned, 87% of the discipline is on the professional side of archaeology, which means that about 13% of the discipline in academic archaeology tends to control a lot of the publications, conferences, and discussions that happen in archaeology. Excuse me, as well, a lot of the material that is developed in the commercial side of archaeology is often left as gray literature or held as proprietary information because of the nature of consulting firms in archaeology. And there are a lot of issues with this because there are a lot of financial restrictions to the commercial side coming into the academic side of archaeology. Conferences and publication outlets are very expensive, and they're very restrictive to people publishing or presenting in those outlets. And this creates a lot of problems with archaeology as an international practice. Archaeology and the archaeology itself does not follow modern borders, and it doesn't care about modern laws or modern languages. So it makes accessibility to archaeology very difficult. But then it also creates these feudal-like landscapes of methodology and governance with a very fragmented landscape of organizations that represent the different parts of archaeology. And I argue that this wastes a lot of time and money, as there are a lot of parts that are moving towards the same goal, but they're constantly reinventing the wheel, as we saw with the 20 or so different standard archives and databases and data silos that are being created around the world. And this creates a lot of issues with data accessibility. There's very little systematicity or systematic data collection, which makes replicability and repeatability very difficult. And that makes the research and development of a lot of archaeological techniques the burden of the individual, which is often a burden that only the academic side of archaeology can bear. And that creates a lot of other issues with the material itself, material storage, and material analysis. Then on the side of standards and rights, the lack of definition in archaeology makes understanding the state of the discipline very difficult. It's not clear. I've been calling the professional side of archaeology commercial archaeology, but there are many different terms that we use for this side of archaeology: commercial, professional, rescue, preventative, development-led. What is it really? And then that leads to questions like, what makes someone an archaeologist? Which leads to issues of accessibility. How does someone become an archaeologist? And does the education that they get equate to the skills that they require for the jobs that they will get in the future? And then that asks questions like, is the cost of education worth the investment that we're putting in? And that raises really big issues about whether or not archaeology is accessible to those outside of the dominant traditions, and whether archaeology is accessible to those from low-income backgrounds. And that creates a lot of other issues with rights and protections. Who has access to the data? Who has access to published material? As I mentioned before, there's a lot of conference fees and a lot of journal publication fees. And that creates more issues with who gets authorship rights, who is qualified to excavate. And then most importantly, what happens if something goes wrong? If someone is a bad archaeologist, who can you talk to and who can you speak to remedy that situation? And more important, the issues with grievance processes needs to be more solidified, because as we've seen in the US with the SAA, what happens if there are issues of sexual harassment or racism, sexism, or other issues? Who can you talk to, and what are the outcomes of those grievance processes? So in conclusion, I argue that archaeology needs to be smaller. It needs to be more collaborative on an institutional level. We need to work together at an institutional, journal, conference, and university level to bring people together and break down a lot of these barriers. And one of the most important things that we need to do is establish an archaeological domain on an international level and create something that provides us with stable but dynamic definitions so that we can continuously discuss and develop this internationally. And most importantly, we need to continuously look at the discipline itself, not just method, theory, and specializations, but the broader discipline to improve diversity, labor rights, legal conventions, and more of these issues. So that's my presentation and my sources. Thanks.